this doesn't happen very often. I mean, this is a very special event.
Mm-hmm.
One of cinema's great directors, and a previously unheard of cut of one of his films. We're rediscovering or discovering for the first time his vision of looking to get out. This is, like I said to him, this is enough to make me salivate. It's a big event for movie fans.
Oh, I think so.
Yeah, I want to welcome everyone to the show. If you're listening on our homepage, or if you're listening on a different server or a different page, one of our players, we do have a chat room. You can log into our chat room by visiting our homepage site at blogtalkradio.com/moviegeeksunited. There's lots of film fans in there, and you can submit questions for our guests and converse with other film fans in that chat room. And if you have a question for any of our remaining guests, you can dial in 718-508-9477. And at the top of the hour, we'll be speaking to another terrific actor, Mr. Burt Young, and that's very, very thrilling for us, too. So, but let's get to our next guest. I'm really looking forward to discussing this project with our next guest. Nick Dawson is editor at filminfocus.com, and he writes a weekly interview column, The Director Interviews, for Filmmaker magazine. His entertaining and insightful cinematic musings have also graced the pages of Empire, Uncut, The London Times, and The Scotsman. In his new book, Being Hal Ashby, Life of a Hollywood Rebel, Mr. Dawson lovingly traces Ashby's life and his unique, tender, and thought-provoking legacy of films. You can purchase the book yourself from our homepage. If you click on the front cover icon there at the top of the page, it'll take you directly to the place where you can purchase it, and I highly recommend it. It's a phenomenal book about a phenomenal artist. Of that book, Peter Biskind raves, finally, a book, and a very good one indeed, on Hal Ashby, the neglected, least appreciated director of the 70s. Hopefully, Dawson's excellent volume will revive Ashby's reputation and get him the attention he deserves. It is a great pleasure to welcome Nick Dawson to Movie Geeks United. Mr. Dawson, hello.
Hey, how are you, Jamie?
Hey, Mr. Dawson, how are you? Thank you so much for being with us.
No, it's a pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me on.
I love this. I love this book, and I love that there is finally like Mr. Biskind expressed, finally a volume that pays tribute to this remarkable filmmaker. But tell me a little bit about you and when your love for film started, and what role Ashby played in that for you.
Well, my love for film goes back about 20 years, just to when I was a little kid, and I don't know. For me, it's a little embarrassing to admit, but my love for film sprang out of watching sort of movies like The Wizard of Oz, and that led to a sort of rather unusual obsession with Judy Garland that it's probably best not to get into humor.
That's fine.
My wife always gets a bit uncomfortable when I talk about that because it sort of presents it's something of a cliche to be obsessed with Judy Garland as a kid, but not I'm not sure if I quite fulfill that cliche ultimately. But it's weird because the Ashby, I came to become interested in Ashby not so much initially from a love of his films. It was more as a real, I read Peter Biskind's book, Easy Riders, Raging Bulls, and I love the book. I think it's a phenomenal portrait of the new Hollywood generation, and I really became fascinated with Ashby's story, or such as it is in the book, and I really was intrigued to find out more, and that was really my entry point into the whole Ashby experience.
Yeah. So when you read the book, and obviously you began to investigate Ashby's films, what about those films struck you, and Ashby's particular voice? What were you taken by?
I think there's a real... I mean, one of the things that people say about Ashby is that, Andrew Sarris in particular, he said once something like, Hal Ashby intrigues me. He couldn't really piece together he couldn't create a straight line through Ashby's movies. At the time anyway, people struggled to fit him into the Auteur puzzle, but I think there's a real interesting dialogue that runs through them about sort of there's a lot of men in his movies looking for something that they ultimately can't find, and if you know his story, then that makes a little bit of sense. I don't think it was a conscious thing, but I think he was drawn to stories like that, and he has a real sort of idiosyncratic voice and a sort of slyly political, very sort of subtext rather than text, but and he had a great sense of humor. There's a real warmth to his movies as well. Even when you're talking about him bringing to the screen a writer like Robert Towne, who sort of typically is not the most sort of emotional of writers in terms of the warmth of his characters. So he's just got a very rich, just a really fantastic, rich body of work, and it was really exciting for me to come to that as somebody who, in a way, viewed it through his life as a lens rather than just viewing the films in isolation.
Yeah. Well, speaking of his body of work, all of the films are extremely compassionate and like we've mentioned before, very warm. Even when he tackles taboo subjects,
right.
with Coming Home, the paraplegic sex he deals with. He deals with the Vietnam War very early, and ageism with Harold and Maude, with a much older woman and a much younger man. But all of the perspectives are very tender and compassionate. And that speaks to the man too, from what I've heard from Mr. Voigt.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he was really an incredibly compassionate person, and he didn't like to judge his characters. When he was, I think it was working with Robert Towne was a real challenge for him, because he said at one point, I don't like these people. I wouldn't want to spend time with them, but I would never judge them. So, and that's really the approach that he brought to his films. He really always tried to find something to like in everybody, and to find the common thread between his experiences and their experiences. And he was never afraid to tackle the big subjects, because that sort of humanistic aspect allowed them to become that much more accessible to people. And I think he also was sort of mischievous and playful, and the idea of tackling those taboo subjects was kind of very appealing to him. There was once a project that he wanted to make about this guy who basically sort of picked prominent members of society whose political views he disagreed with, and sort of picked them off one by one. And it's an incredibly edgy script. He never would have got it made in a million years, but it was a pet project of his for sort of 3 or 4 years that he just had on the back burner that he wanted to get made, and that was sort of a testament to he was really very, very sort of forward thinking, and a friend of his once said that he was sort of about 2 or 3 years ahead of the zeitgeist. And I think looking back at his movies from the 70s, they still feel very, very fresh, and I think that's just a sign of just how true that statement is.
Especially Being There, that was way ahead of its time and still relevant to today.
Yeah,
it sure
absolutely.
is.
Yeah. I mean, there was. It's funny, at the time that it came out, within a couple of months, it came out in late '79, and just a few months after that, Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan were both trying to use it as political capital against each other.
Right.
And, you know, sort of 20, 25 years on, during the middle of George W. Bush's presidency, it was once again had a certain prescience, if you like.
Yeah, it did.
Tell me a little bit about, in your research, I understand that Hal had a very troubled upbringing, and I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit about that and how you think that played a role in his point of view as a filmmaker.
Sure. His parents divorced when he was about 6 years old, and his father committed suicide when he was 12 years old. And there were kind of, well, there's a lot of controversy surrounding that. If you speak to members of his family, they will say that it was an accidental death, but based on reporting from the time, it seems very likely that it was a suicide. And, you know, according to some people, Hal was the person to discover the body. That's, in a way, it's kind of irrelevant whether that was not the case, because that was the story that he told sometimes. So whether or not he was the first person, it clearly had a massive and incredibly traumatic impact on him. And I think if you're to look at the impact of his father's death, it really, particularly at an age like that, when, you know, most teenagers are already sort of somewhat confused by the world and trying to find their place in it. And if you suddenly lose a parent, it's the kind of thing that can have a massively detrimental effect. And I think Ashby had a lot of issues with both authority and abandonment that really played a massive role in sort of throughout his life, and particularly in his dealings with women in the case of abandonment, and with the authority issues with studios. I mean, he really struggled to adhere to the wishes of studio bosses and producers, and had an incredibly antagonistic relationship with them in almost all cases. And that, during the latter stages of his career, that really became a big issue. And, you know, looking back on his career, a lot of people talk about the significance of drugs. The ironic thing about that is that the producers and the studio executives that he antagonized were the people who spread, you know, or encouraged stories of his drug use as a reason to sort of to blacklist him, not literally, but sort of bring down his reputation. And so those are the stories that remain ultimately as the more dominant. Whereas actually, I think if you look dispassionately at his life story, you could kind of say that he pissed off all the wrong people. Yeah. You know, rather than he took drugs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And really, you spoke of your first exposure to him, which was in the Easy Riders Raging Bulls. He is a dominant figure in that book, and really, from that group of 70s filmmakers, really the most tragic in a way. And he has been kind of maligned with the drug abuse talk. But all you need to do is watch his films, and you get such a sense of who he really was. It's remarkable. And I'm wondering, when you took on this book, what was the process? What was the journey? How long did it take you? And what were the highlights of that journey for you?
It's been a very interesting journey. I probably started thinking about it seriously in about the latter stages of 2002. So it's probably been about 5 or 6 years in the making, and a lot of that time was simply research. I began working on the book when I was still living in the UK, and it was a very sort of slow and difficult process, because all the materials and all the people that I wanted to have access to were about between 3,000 and 5,000 miles away. So that was a little problematic. But in terms of the highlights. I had a fantastic time researching the book in LA for a number of months, and in the process met my wife.
Wow.
Who was working at the library where I was doing most of my research. So that counts as a definite highlight. I think I get no dinner tonight unless I mention that.
Yeah, if she's listening, you're in trouble if you don't mention that. Yeah.
Yeah, she's probably going to download it even if she's not listening. So, but no, it's been incredibly fun, and one of the things that was most remarkable about this was I was basically, somebody in my early 20s living in Scotland who nobody in the film community had any knowledge of at all, really. I mean, I was a film reviewer for Empire, as you mentioned at the top of the segment, but really there was literally no name recognition. However, Ashby's name was this remarkable catalyst in opening doors, and it was just really amazing to see the number of people that, people like John, who talked to me when really they just trusted that because I was writing a book about Hal Ashby, that I was somebody who it was worthwhile for them to share their stories with, and that's been one of the really a remarkable thread that has run through the whole process of writing this book.
I am stricken by that too, because it seems that everyone that collaborated with him, everyone that knew him, couldn't help but fall in love with Ashby.
Yeah.
And what was the common thread in terms of Ashby as a creative collaborator? What did his collaborators appreciate most about him in the working environment?
Well, I think he was somebody who was really, it's kind of a cliche now, but one that's seldom true in a way, bizarrely. But he was really all about the work. He was completely egoless, and so many people that I've spoken to would really literally talk about the fact that he would listen to ideas from a grip just as readily as he would from the DP or one of the actors or the screenwriter. He was literally like, if you had an idea and you were on the set, any idea was one that he was willing to listen to, and he was truly collaborative, and he any idea that was going to help the film was one that he was willing to get on board with. In the case of the film like Coming Home, that resulted in basically the actors doing a huge amount of work improvising to help with the script, because they began filming without a script, and similarly on 8 Million Ways to Die with less happy results, because the film that was ultimately released was not one that he was involved with creatively in the editing. He was fired beforehand. So I mean, he really trusted everybody that he worked with completely, and in the cases where he was allowed to follow through, the results were remarkable. If you look at the director's cut of Looking to Get Out, it's a great example of his creative vision followed through to its logical conclusion. Because you look at the version that we have of the film at the moment, and you compare it to the one that is going to be released in a month or so, and they're really night and day. The changes are not necessarily that great, but the impact that they have is quite incredible.
Yeah, let's talk about Looking to Get Out now. Did you come across it in your research that he had made this cut and given it to UCLA? Was that the first you heard about it?
Right. One of the guys that I contacted during my research was somebody called Dan Salik, and he'd actually seen a cut of the film in the mid-'80s when there'd kind of been these sort of below-the-radar screenings of the film in the hope of having it released. I think it was about in 1986, and that release never happened, sadly, but there were kind of whispers kind of going around LA at that time that something might be happening. And so he told me about this, and so I kind of had my eyes open for something. And when I was going to the UCLA Film Archive, I looked at their catalog of Ashby movies and noticed that the number of reels that they had for Looking to Get Out was slightly, I think it was, they had 7 reels rather than 6, or it was something like that. And so I take a look at that one, and it turned out to be this other version.
Wow. And why do you think he did that? Obviously, he was unhappy with what the studio did to how they recut it, and he had his own vision that he wanted to protect. But why didn't he share it with anyone, and why did he give it privately to UCLA, do you think?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think he reached a stage in the 80s when he lost some of his fight, basically. His dealings with Lorimar, the production company that he had a 3-picture deal with, that ended very, very badly. And this was the final picture of those 3. I think that there was a part of him that just didn't want to have any more conflict regarding that relationship or that film. It had been in post-production for almost 2 years. And that's pretty much unprecedented, at any stage. It had been a very, very troubled film, both in the shooting and in post. And I think he basically trusted that somebody would find it, and that eventually, what has happened would happen. That somebody would find it, and that it would get out into the world, and that his version would be seen. But as I said before, he was really incredibly egoless. He'd done it. He'd finished the film. It existed, and that was, at the time, I think that was probably enough for him.
Yeah. Having seen it, I'm sure several times.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about it, and where do you think it stands in his canon?
Well, I think the really easy division that has been made in Ashby's life is to say that the 70s were the time when he made good movies, and the 80s were the time that he made bad movies. That almost works as a theory, except that this new version of Looking to Get Out sort of throws a spanner in the works. And I think it ranks along with the movies that he made in the 70s, which are all, in my opinion, just really fantastic films. In terms of the differences between the version that we have and this one, there are a number of really fantastic and sort of idiosyncratic scenes and sequences that are in this film and that aren't in the previous version, that really add an incredible sort of character and individuality to this version. And also another really, really important distinction is the pacing and the rhythm of the film, because the existing cut that we have was cut to try and be like a more conventional studio movie, to be a sort of, they tried to make it more of a comedy than it was in the cutting, and more fast-paced. And there's a much more a much looser feel to this, and a much more laid-back and natural rhythm to this, which is just wonderful. And it's one of those things that it's difficult to quite work out how he did that. But it is.
Yeah, it can be a kind of elusive, and it's amazing that they trimmed, in effect, something like 15 minutes from the film.
Yeah. And
in restoring that footage and putting his own kind of slant on a new cut, does it? You've mentioned this previously, just touched upon a little bit, but does it feel like a different film altogether when you compare it to the older version?
I think it's a little bit like houses, in the sense that you can say that all the bricks are pretty much the same, but you can make a lot of different shapes with it. there's a lot of very, very similar components and aspects, but Ashby was the great master builder, and he hadn't quite finished the house in the first place, and somebody else finished it, and that's really the difference. Is that this is a film that really is totally his.
Yeah. And so with the Sarasota Film Festival upcoming, it's going to enjoy its world premiere, and it also is accompanied by a tribute to Mr. Ashby and a retrospective. But are you moderating that tribute?
I will be involved, yes. I think I'll be sort of talking to a number of the sort of friends and colleagues of Ashby who will be there to pay tribute to him.
Fantastic. And I believe it's Mr. Voight, Norman Jewison, who we didn't even touch upon this, that Ashby actually started in the business as an editor, an Academy Award-winning editor for In the Heat of the Night, correct?
Yeah.
That's incredible. And Ileana Douglas, who is Melvyn Douglas's was it granddaughter?
That's right. Yeah, she visited him during the filming. So
of Being there, yeah.
Yeah, and, that'll be very interesting.
And his daughter Lee. And tell me a little bit about that story here. Was he aware that he had? Obviously, was he aware that he had a child and that she was trying to find him? Do you think?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, there's a letter that he wrote. Well, just to give it a little context, he got married at the age of 18, and had a daughter, but left when she was still under 1 year old, and this was sort of in the late 40s. He went off ultimately to Los Angeles, and eventually got involved in the film industry. It wasn't a direct transition. And during the early 60s, he wrote to his mother, and there's a very poignant letter that he wrote to her talking about his relationship with his daughter, because they never had any contact that she remembers. Obviously, she was just months old when they were last sort of physically together. And he said, I will meet with Lee when everything is right. It's a very easy thing to say that you'll do something when everything is right, but in our lives, in anybody's life, seldom is everything right. And that was really the case, is that as time went on, the idea of meeting the daughter that you abandoned is never an easy proposition, but to constantly put it off makes it all the more difficult. And he was aware that she would write letters, and he was aware that she would call, but he never quite got over his fear of how he would deal with that.
Yeah. Yeah. But how is she today? Obviously, she's an older woman, and her relationship with her dad has to be quite similar to ours, which is through his films.
Right. I mean, she grew up as somebody whose only communication, if you like, or communing with her father was through his films. So she would always go and see the latest Hal Ashby movie when it hit the theaters, through the 70s and the 80s. And, her mother and other family members, gave her, told her as much as they could, but a strange and sort of rather, on a personal level, great aspect of writing this book was that I was able to allow her to get an insight into her father that she never had through talking to her about him and sharing with her the stuff that I had learned through researching the book.
It's a remarkable story, and your book on Mr. Ashby is remarkable as well. The book is Being Hal Ashby, Life of a Hollywood Rebel. And Mr. Dawson, I look forward to meeting you at the festival, and I also look forward to bringing you back on in the coming months when we conduct our all-encompassing Hal Ashby tribute, reviewing his entire career. That would be a great pleasure for us.
Well, thank you. I look forward to doing that with you also.